All right, well, welcome everyone to episode 5, our 1881 series, What's on Tap. My name is Josh Crew, and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at the UConn Foundation, and welcome. We're thrilled to have you join us. We've got an incredible panel of alums and academic experts joining us today. Tonight, we're tackling all things funky, tart, fruity, and sour. So if that's your jam, pun intended, we're here for that. So ever wonder why our beer seems so tart that your face puckers up, or as I like to describe it, the enamel just got ripped off of your teeth? Tonight's all about you. So we'll find out everything you need to know about why. We'll find out why you've had something that just feels funky and twisted and you're not entirely sure what's going on. We'll cover that too. And if you've ever had a beer that's just a fruit explosion, or maybe one that brought you back to your childhood and said, man, remember those Warhead candies that we had? This is what I'm drinking right now. That's the conversation we're having tonight. So buckle up, pour yourself a drink, and we're going to get started in just a minute. So bear with me. Joining our panel today in alphabetical order, we have a veteran to our 1881 series, What's on Tap. Joining us today, advanced Cicerone and education and training manager with Artisanal Brewing Ventures. And tonight's moderator, we have the incomparable Max Finance. Max is a 2015 graduate of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Joining Max on our panel, we have Chloe Giroud Martel, former head horticulturist and now co-taproom manager at OEC Brewing in Oxford, Connecticut. Chloe is our soon-to-be graduate of UConn as she's finishing up her bachelor's degree after a long and illustrious career as a tattoo artist. And joining us from our academic ranks, Jennifer Pascal, our resident academic and scientist, is going to be joining us today. She's the associate professor in residence and associate department head for the chemical and biomolecular engineering department at UConn. She's a self-dubbed beer fanatic and helps us understand the science behind the beer, the brewing process, as well as what you will find out that UConn students are learning about this incredible concept. Coming in loud and clear from Seattle, Washington, we have Josh Waldman, head brewer for the nationally distributed Elysian Brewing Company, a 2002 grad of CLAS. He has traveled the country and made a name for himself in not only Texas, Colorado, and now in Seattle at various breweries before landing as the man in charge of the Elysian national reputation and brand. So thanks for joining us, Josh. And last but not least, I call him the godfather of Connecticut craft beer. We have David Wallner of Willimantic Brewing Company, a grad of CLAS from 1982. David is known for being one of the pioneers of the Connecticut craft beer industry here and has been a mentor to many along the way, and many of the folks that are on this panel know him well. David's joining us again on our 1881 series stage. And in fact, I tout this from the rooftops as well. David is one of the instrumental people who helped us get the 1881 series, the initial in-person concept going. And then when we had to pivot online, he was one of the first to raise his hand and say, how can we help? So David, always awesome to be spending some time with you. So thanks for joining us as well, and to all of our panelists. Before we jump in, just a couple of quick housekeeping things so you know how to participate today. As we've learned from these, and if you've been to any beer type of discussion or brewery or whatever it is, this is a social thing, right? We realize you can't be on screen with us, but we want you to participate. You can do that by jumping in the chat. We want to know where you're logging in from. We want to know your untapped profile name so we can be friends along the way, right? We also want to know what you're drinking. Yes, we want to know what you're drinking. It better be a beer, but if it's not, that's okay. We'll find out if we can get you turned on to some today as well. So drop that into the chat. Let us know where you're coming in from, and we can get that ball rolling. If you have questions tonight, there is a Q&A specific button on your toolbar. We're going to ask you to direct those there. That way, Max and I can kind of keep an eye on how those are going and making sure it doesn't get lost in the chat function. So if you can do us the favor by making sure those go in there, we greatly appreciate it. And we'll get to as many as we can before the end of the night tonight. And last but not least, I'm joined by my illustrious colleague as well, Caitlin Krause, our Director of Alumni Relations for the School of Engineering. Kate and I will be monitoring the chat and being on hand should you need anything, technical assistance as best as we can, given the scenario. So if you have any questions or need anything, you can ping one of us along the way. That's my stump speech for tonight. I am going to throw this over to Max. Max is going to take it away and teach us a little bit that we need to know about all things sour. So welcome, everybody. Thanks, Max. Turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Josh. Appreciate those fantastic intros for myself and the rest of the panel. As always, I'm super excited to be here. Really excited to talk about sour beers with everyone who's tuning in tonight. And like Josh said, please let us know in the chat what you guys are drinking, because it's way more fun for us too if we can see, oh, someone's drinking that beer that I've had before, or I truly love that beer. What do you guys think of this beer? As you guys are paying attention at home, we are going to be drinking 5 beers tonight from the 3 breweries, from David and Josh and Chloe's associated breweries. We're going to be drinking an OEC beer called Aether, then an Elysian beer called Salt and Seed, which is a watermelon Goza. A sour beer from Willy Brew, Willimantic Brewing Company, called Overnight Sensation. Another Elysian beer called Altered Contact, tart IPA there. And then a pretty crazy one from OEC called Ouzo Ariza. And we'll get to the details on that one towards the end of the presentation. But let's start with like this general idea of what is a sour beer. And if you have seen maybe on social media, you might already know that I don't love the term sour beers as a catch-all descriptor. Why, you might ask? Well, I think it gets thrown around too colloquially, and I think too many people get confused about the idea that sour beers are a singular style. And as we're going to learn tonight, sour beers are anything but a singular style. They can range from just a tiny bit tart as part of the flavor profile for a beer like a Belgian Wit, the inspiration for beers like Shock Top or Allagash White that can be a little bit acidic, but it definitely wouldn't be a sour beer, all the way to something like Josh alluded to in the opening, where it's so sour and so acidic, it's ripping the enamel off your teeth. Very different beers, very different sensory experiences, and different ways to get to those endpoints too. So just so we're all on the same page, I'm going to throw it over to Jen to start us off here with some definitions and a little bit of an intro to some terms we're going to encounter tonight as we're talking about these beers. As you guys heard in the introduction, Jen has the fanciest title by far out of any of us. Department of Molecular Biology and Chemistry. She's the smartest one on the call. So we're going to let her take the intro and the definitions here. So Jen, take it away.
Maybe like highest title, but I know the least, I guarantee you. So yeah, I wanted to preface with that as well. Like I'm not an expert. I don't brew every day and have a ton of experience, but I have been homebrewing for about 10 years, and I really enjoy the connection it has to my background in chemical engineering, because every single part of the brewing process involves chemical engineering, which I didn't discover until, fairly recently, to be honest. And so how I kind of started at UConn with brewing was very recently. So last year, I got some money. The School of Engineering actually gave me a little bit of money to start a class in brewery engineering, just to learn, the basics of the brewing process, talk about the science and engineering that goes into it, and also hands-on stuff like how do you start home brewing, how can you scale things up, what kinds of different innovations can you do when it comes to brewing. And so that unfortunately got cut short with COVID, because in March, this was offered in the spring, had about 35 chemical engineering juniors and seniors in it at the time. And some of them are here, I think. They were texting me saying hello. So hello, alumni of chemical engineering. And so unfortunately got cut a little bit short due to COVID, but it was a great first time offering. We were actually scheduled to go to tour Willy Brew on a day, I think it was almost exactly a year ago. So hopefully to offer it again and keep expanding upon it, to make it even bigger and bigger. So just to kind of all get on the same page, as Max was saying, with some different terms that we'll talk about throughout the night. So with sour beers, like if you've ever brewed before or been to a brewery where they're brewing, more like clean beers like ales and lagers and stuff, you've probably seen that sanitization is really, really important. Keeping, all kinds of bacteria out because you don't want your beer to be contaminated. However, with the more sour tasting beers, that sourness comes from the bacteria and the wild yeast that are in the environment. And one of the ways to get those is through using what's called a coolship. And that's an anglicized version of this Flemish word, because brewers in Belgium were using these coolships. They were actually originally hollowed out tree trunks, I think. They were using them to cool their beer down, because at the time, or cool the wort down, because at the time, we still didn't know that yeast was a living organism. We didn't discover that until the 1800s. So beer was made through spontaneous fermentation, meaning that wild yeasts and things from the environment were brought into the wort and created the alcohol, essentially. So these cool ships are basically just very shallow, rectangular type vessels, shallow, providing more surface area for cooling down. And so once, you know, you mash in and everything, and then you can put your wort into a cool ship to let it cool down and also get some of that wild yeast and bacteria in there to eventually lead to some of these sour flavors that we're talking about. And so cool ship is one way to do this. Another way to do this that is a lot quicker. So this, like if you're doing open fermentation with the cool ships, that can take up to years. If you want to do it a lot quicker, a way to do that is kettle souring or quick souring, where basically you add in lactobacillus bacteria, which is found in things like yogurt. And so instead of converting the sugars to alcohol, the lactobacillus converts it to lactic acid. And so the acid, you know, causes the pH to drop. So pH is basically a measure of acidity of an aqueous solution, a solution with water. And so the lower the pH, the more acidic it is. The higher the pH, the more alkaline it is. So pH of 7 is neutral. And so yeah, once this bacteria is added in, then that causes the pH to drop. And then you can go about the kind of, you know, traditional brewing process from there. And this can be done in the course of days rather than months or years, like with a cool ship. So you see the term kettle sour, you think like a couple of days, quick, add some bacteria to it. One other thing that you might hear too is Brettanomyces or Brett. So that's a type of yeast that is often used in the production of these types of beers as well, because it doesn't necessarily give you that sour flavor, but it can kind of give these funky flavors that you taste in these sour types of beers. And so it can take a little bit longer to ferment and things like that when using Brett, but there are also some potential downsides to it as well, because it can eventually produce some kind of off compounds that you might not want in your beer. But I think David is going to talk about what you can do to kind of get around that problem, basically like when sours go wrong. So you can end up with things like acetic acid, which is vinegar, or you can end up with diacetyl, which at high levels can cause your beer to taste like really buttery. So yeah, I think David and some of the other panelists will talk about how you can remedy some of these issues. You know, if you ever are brewing sour beers at home, or maybe you experience some of these when you're out and you're like, that tastes like a little bit buttery, and how you can kind of get around that. So that's just like a very 30,000 foot view of sour production. And I'm sure everyone will get into a lot of details and a lot of the cool stuff that they're doing at these different breweries.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. And for sure, you know, as you guys at home are going to see tonight, a lot of what we're going to talk about is sort of in generalities. There's a ton to know about sour beers, how they're made, the million different ways you can make them. Before we get too far, I do want to recommend this as a resource for you guys at home. It's a book called American Sour Beers. It's a great book. If you read it, though, you'll see that you know, this book follows 30 different breweries around the country and sort of talks you through how they make beer. And the takeaway here is that all 30 of the breweries have a different method. So even if it's two breweries both doing a kettle sour, like Jen was just talking about, they might have different methodologies for how to kettle sour. And same thing with if they're using a cool ship or somewhere in between, souring in barrels and then blending together. This is definitely one segment of beer where there are 1,000 ways to get to the same or your version of the same endpoint. So I say let's jump right into the beers, right? Everyone at home's drinking a beer already. Everyone on the panel I haven't seen take a sip yet. So let's start out with this OEC Aether. And I guess I'm going to throw it over to Chloe to introduce us to this beer and talk to us a little bit about, you know, what OEC does and how you try and get the flavor profile that you get out of this beer.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chloe. As you can see, I'm actually here in the OEC tap room tonight. So That's fun. And so, yeah, so we're going to drink Aether first. So Aether is our sour pale ale that has been dry hopped. And it has a very Brett forward characteristic to it. So you're going to perceive when you try this beer a lot of sort of tropical fruit, pineapple notes. There's no fruit added to this, so that is coming entirely from the Brett characteristic. And so here at OEC, for all of our sour beers, we actually utilize yeasts that we harvested from here on the property. So all of our yeasts are indigenous to us. They were originally harvested off of the fruit in our horticultural areas. As Josh had mentioned earlier in the introductions, I was formerly the head horticulturist here. So we have a number of horticulture areas. We have some berry patches. We have a number of orchard trees sort of sprinkled sporadically throughout the grounds. We've got stone fruit, and we have 3 greenhouses, 2 of which are citrus greenhouses and 1 is an herb greenhouse. And so our yeasts were cultivated from all over the grounds. We do, because they are not pure yeast strains, we do have to keep them healthy. So about quarterly, we will kind of refresh them with brewer yeast strains, usually from RVA Labs. But yeah, all of our yeasts in our sour beers are indigenous to us, which kind of allows us to have a unique OEC profile. We've had a lot of people tell us that every time we release a beer, no matter what kind of beer it is, it tastes uniquely like an OEC beer, and we're really proud of that. And so, yeah, so Aether is, like I was saying, a pale ale. It's brewed with both wheat, malt, and oats, and those wild yeasts that I was previously talking about. As Jen was talking about with cool ships, so we have a large copper cool ship here. Actually, let me just, if I turn it around, you guys can see a little bit of our brewing area. Look at that. So we have up here, so that is our mill silo. Our mill is right there, and then the grain silo. And then we mill in, everything sits in the silo overnight, and then it gets piped over on our brew days over here to the mash tun, and then moved over to the lauter tun. And then we don't have a separate kettle, so then this guy doubles as our kettle again. And then we also don't have a whirlpool. So all of our beers, regardless of whether they're sour or our non-sour beers, they all go through our cool ship. So let's take a walk and I'll show you guys the cool ship. So we actually have, so this is our cool ship. It's going to be a little echoey in here, I think, but this is our copper cool ship. So everything comes from our kettles over there, gets piped into the cool ship, and then depending on the beer, it could be anywhere from just a couple of hours if we're just settling out proteins for like non-sour beers, up until 24, 36 hours overnight. And then with some exceptions, most of our beers, almost all of our beers, then go through our Beaudelet chiller. And so our Beaudelet chiller, I'm going to walk out of here because it's really echoey. But our Beaudelet chiller is a really unique piece of equipment. As far as we know, it is the only one actually working in the country. That we know of, there are a couple more in the country. One of them is a display piece at Victory Brewing. And then I've heard stories of one in a storage unit somewhere in New Jersey. I'm not sure about that. But yeah, so the Beaudelet chiller is a really cool piece of equipment that we utilize. And then once our beers go through there, then they end up in whatever fermentation vessel they might end up in, whether it be steel, foeders. We have a couple of granite fermentation vessels, or barrels as well. So for ether in particular, ether actually goes into a foeder and ages in the foeder for about 3 months. Yeah, so I'm not sure, Max, if there's anything that you think I could clear up further than that.
I think that definitely a really nice in-depth discussion of ether. I seem to remember you telling me that this beer spent a lot of time in oak as well, right? Before it sort of gets the dry hop in.
So this actually, older versions of ether were all barrel aged. This newer version of ether, because we now want to be able to put a sour out into production. You know, we were previously a sour only brewery. So we will be, I think June 7th will be our 7-year anniversary. And so for the first about 4 years, we were sour only, and then we expanded to lagers as well. And so we now have a number of our non-sour beers out in the world that we are actually, you know, putting out there for people to pick up on the shelves. And because we were a sour only brewery, we wanted to be able to have some representation of sour beers out there in the world too for people to try. So yeah, so we sort of reconfigured ether to make it a little bit faster of a process. Now, that being said, for our newer version of ether, some of the beer that gets blended in will sometimes come from various wine barrels that we have on site, but it is not exclusively barrel aged any longer. But more to your point about oak, our foeder is an oak foeder as well.
Gotcha. I will save the specific questions about like what kind of flavors we can get from barrel aging in sour beers till we get to maybe Goza.
Yeah.
Anyone else on the panel have anything they want to say or thoughts about ether before we move on to beer number 2? All right. Thanks, Chloe. We'll come back to you in a minute. Cheers. So for beer number 2, we're going to start talking about the Elysian Salt and Sour. And this is a watermelon Goza. I'm going to let Josh do most of the talking here. But one thing I did want to say is that, there's sort of this new trend in the craft beer world for a lot of fruited sour beers. I personally think that Gozas and Berliner Weisses, both of which Jen mentioned sort of in her intro, I think they lend themselves really well to having fruit added to them because both of them have more of a mild sourness as a general rule, not as an all-encompassing rule, of course. But then there's a little bit of kickback sometimes from people that say fruit doesn't belong in my beer, or I want traditional beer. I don't want fruit in my beer. Well, those people are ignoring the fact that if you go to Belgium, you could get fruit in your beer for centuries now. In a Berliner Weiss, it's been traditional and historical to add woodruff or raspberry syrup to your beer, sort of to cut through that acidity and to add some sweetness and some fruit flavor. So I think, and I really like this, salt and seed watermelon Goza, but I think it's sort of a nice touch to add the fruit, and then also not totally out of the historical realm of things. So Josh, why don't you take it away and sort of talk more about this?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks everyone for the intro and for having me. My name's Josh. I'm the head brewer, the brewmaster here at Elysian. I've been here for since 2012. I've been brewing professionally since a few months after I graduated in 2002. I worked at Magic Hat in Vermont for a while, and then kind of made my way across the country. Yeah, Max, absolutely. I agree that it's a very interesting sort of split, right? There's the people who think that fruit maybe doesn't have a place, and I know that there's a long history of people who were maybe covering up some faults or using fruit to sort of mask things that weren't perfect about the beer. And then I think there's a lot of rich history, like you mentioned, in the Berliner Weiss, and then certainly in Belgium as well. Ours, yeah, cool, Space Dust fan. Ours, this particular beer, Salt and Seed, is in a Goza style. It is a fruited Goza, which we are seeing quite a bit more of, right? This one actually came out of one of our brew pubs. Someone was looking around at a new vendor kind of came to them and said, I've got fresh juiced, I guess, fresh pressed watermelons. And this, what do you want to do with it? And the idea to do a Goza came around and said, yeah, let's do a fruited Goza. So that was essentially that was the creativity behind it initially. And then of course, once things start to scale, once we take an interest in it and we say, this could be something cool and we could try this again, then for me, the gears start really turning as to like, how do you produce this on a production system? So for example, our Capitol Hill brewery was a 20-barrel brew house. And now our production brewery at Airport Way, also in Georgia, in South Seattle, is a 60-barrel brew house with 240-barrel fermenters. So trying to take a 20-barrel recipe into a 240-barrel recipe that we're actually doing over and over again. We're doing about one batch of that a week for the next, I don't even know, till summer was over. It's been an interesting challenge. I know that Jennifer had mentioned that some beers, some people are going to use more of a souring technique, like a souring tank, or kind of a modified kettle sour process, which is sort of what we do. We will take the beer and start it through the brew house, get through mashing lauter into our kettle, and then we'll heat it up to like a pasteurization hold, and we'll keep it there just to kill off anything that, if anybody's not familiar, lactic acid bacteria are hanging out on malts all the time, on barley. And if you were to just kind of mash at a certain temperature, you could just sour that portion. And so that's kind of a lot of the history in some of these beers. There's probably a certain point at which all beers were sour, or at least most of them were, because before that level of understanding and quality control was there, people were just mashing grains and lactic acid bacteria were present and they kind of took over. So for us, that reproducibility, that level of control is kind of key to a production beer. So we'll take everything through, get it into a pasteurization hold in the kettle, and then we'll transfer it into a fermenter. And right now we have 20 fermenters, 20 240-barrel fermenters, and we're dedicating 2 of them to our souring process right now. So we're cutting our production volumes down to make sure that this is usable. If we were to take a 240 and put it through the brew house and sour entirely in the kettle, it would hold up production. This is one way that we can keep things moving, is that we'll put a portion of it. And this beer in particular is actually only 25% soured. So we'll put a single turn through the brew house, 60 barrels into a souring tank. And we use a dedicated culture. We're using Lactobacillus plantarum. Anybody familiar with it? You see it in the Good Belly products and kind of some other probiotics. It definitely was, for us, was something we had seen in homebrewing forums and wanted to try it. And even though we have a lab and a lot of resources behind us, the pub brewers don't always get the full benefit of the resources. So taking some Good Belly and putting it in the kettle was an option that we tried out. Of course, scaling, we then rely on our lab pretty heavily for this. Some of the interesting benefits, we tried several different lactose species. And Lactoplantarum for us was the most flavorful, at least for this beer and for several of ours. It does have a nice like fruit forward flavor. It also is not very tolerant of hops. So if and when, we get any cross contamination, most of our beers, anybody who knows our portfolio, almost any of our beers, a few IBUs will kill plantarum. We'll be able to eliminate that issue. Fortunately, and I'm knocking on a wooden table, we haven't had any cross contamination issues in years like that. So got to be pretty careful about it, pretty dedicated. Like I said, dedicated tanks, dedicated all the soft materials, we call them, all the gasket materials and hoses. That's all dedicated specifically for these beers. And so we'll fill up a tank. We'll do several turns into a tank and fill it up as much as we can, add the lacto, let it sour. It usually takes about 48 hours. We'll let it go for a few more days just so we can kind of peak at our sort of top level acidity. Because we're using only 25% of this as the soured portion, we want to get that as sour as possible to have the maximum impact there. So once that's finished, we'll take part of that back, bring it into the brew house, back into the kettle, and then heat it up again past that pasteurization temperature, and then we'll treat it like a normal beer again. We'll continue the brewing process. So boil, add hops, go back through our the cooling stages and go through normal fermentation. So that one single turn, that's 60 barrels of soured wort, then we'll follow that up with another 180 barrels of unsoured wort. That's how we kind of get to it.
That's awesome. So, speaking of, 1,000 different methods to get to a sour beer product, that's a very cool method, and lots of in-depth info there for anyone who even dabbles in home brewing, who's paying attention at home. I really appreciate that. Since we're starting to talk about kettle souring, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the idea of where I think sort of I'm kicking this around in my head a little bit, but there are some beer geeks and craft beer geeks who can have a condescending attitude towards kettle sours, which I don't think is fair at all. I think, whether you're talking about kettle souring or straight coolship or anywhere in between or one of the other 1,000 methods, there's an appropriate and even preferable time and a place for all of them. Do you want to talk about, in a little bit of generalities, what styles do you think kettle souring really works well for, and maybe what styles it wouldn't work well for?
Yeah, absolutely. This is like the power of the panel that you have today is, I think we talked about Brettanomyces and some other kind of flavors that would go in there. And Max, you talked about the sort of faults of calling beers sour beers. Now, as a category, it's not very effectual in getting a message across, except that there's increased acidity to it. So yeah, I can understand in a lot of people's perspective that if people were to pass off, say, a kettle sour as something that's maybe a lot more complex, something that had been aged in wood and had been blended and worked on over time, I think that there's maybe a little bit of a disingenuous attitude in that. I don't see that very often anymore, but we've talked about this, and I tend to think of it as a tool, and it does work, for certain styles really well. In fact, we even do it a little bit with some of our stouts, is that we'll do a sour mash portion, but I think it works particularly well for kind of modern contemporary interpretations of Gozas, Berliner in particular. Things that maybe fit into those but aren't entirely to style. I know that there's a lot of historical work that suggests that Berliner and Gozas, of course, had other lactic acid bacteria as well as Brettanomyces in them. But for us, it is a flavor component. It is a tool. Seeing it in those particular styles, the Berliner Goza is kind of where it works pretty well for us. It's repeatable.
I totally agree with everything you just said. Chloe or David, do you want to jump in sort of from the brewery side? And I know that was a little bit more of an open-ended question. Any thoughts on that? Where does kettle souring work well? Where would you want maybe a different method to get to that sour product?
From my point of view, there aren't a lot of beer styles that don't often benefit from a touch of sour. It takes you on the little roller coaster of flavors that go up and down. So you may get that first hit and you get sweetness of a malty, maybe a lactose stout, and then the sourness comes through. I mean, Guinness is a little sour. And, with St. Patrick's Day, just think about that. You're drinking sour beer. You may not have ever thought about it, but it does have that little hint of it. So, I don't think kettle sour or a beer that just gets sour over time. I mean, we've all drank a lot of old beer that, maybe it's past its prime, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's not good. It might even be better in some ways. And you wish you had more of those bottles. It's just, I don't know. I like to drink sour beer.
I totally agree with you. And that's a really great point, David. I think when we think about flavor profiles and the way flavors work together, it's a lot like cooking, right? Where if you're cooking dinner and your dinner just doesn't quite taste right, maybe a pinch of salt or a squeeze of citrus, whether it's lemon or lime, to boost the acidity in that dish is going to boost the overall flavor profile, even if you don't taste the salt or the acid in the finished dish. So first of all, I guess we should mention, in case there's anyone at home who doesn't know, all beers are sour on a pH scale, right? Beers tend to live in the 4 to 5 range, even lower than that, 3s if you're talking about sour beers. So all beers are quote unquote sour by pH. It's just a matter of, do we perceive them as sour? And as David said, just the tiniest bit of sour perception could really add some complexity to just about any beer. Yeah, Chloe, I saw it in our side of the chat just mentioned the Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat book, which is exactly what I'm talking about. 4 ways to spice up your dinner without knowing a whole lot about cooking. Chloe, you want to add to that?
Oh, I just absolutely agreed with you in that there have been so many occasions where I've been cooking something and I'm like, it's almost good. And I'm like, oh, wait, I need like a squeeze of lemon. Yeah. And then it's like, oh, it's beautiful now. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So David, let's throw it back to you, and let's talk about this overnight sensation sour beer from Willimantic Brewing Company. And if everyone on the call has been to Yukon, then you probably know Willimantic Brewing as affectionately Willy Brew. But David, take it away on this beer. Talk us through it.
We're old, but we're not completely sour yet. So the overnight sensational sour was come up. Well, my assistant brewer came up with it, and referring to what Josh had mentioned earlier about the Good Belly, the Lacto Plantarum, it's something that we've been doing for the last few years to sour our wort. And once again, you're not actually making beer when you're adding the Lacto Plantarum. You're adjusting the pH. And for a few years, I was actually just going online and buying capsules, little dissolvable capsules of Lacto Plantarum and opening them up one at a time and putting them into the wort. And then about 24 to 36 hours later, the pH would drop a little bit, try it again, and get it to the point that the beer got sour enough that we felt that it would then brew well. However, way back when I went to Rodenbach Brewery, and I know Jamie had mentioned that Rodenbach's his favorite beer. I came back with Paul Zacco from Zac's Home Brewing, and he said, I can come up with a recipe and we can duplicate something like that. So what we did was we made a great red ale with a lot of melanoid and malt in it. And then we put some lactic acid into the kettle and some tart cherry juice. And we tried to mimic what a Rodenbach would be like. But over time, of course, I realized that souring beer in wooden barrels gave me a lot more depth and character in the beer. So what I started to do was just make a straight red ale and then blend that with some of the barrel-aged beers that were going on in our basement. And we picked up some of the Brett, different types of lacto, different types of sour. So you had complexity just because you're getting the wood character, you get some dryness, and who knows what else was going on in those barrels. So, over time, we've adjusted the way we've made our sour beers. But as Josh was also saying, if you want to be consistent, you need a product that's going to give you duplicable results. And I did find the Good Belly is a great way and sort of a quicker way to get to that result. However, saying all that, I still dip into those barrels every now and then. I know I invited you and Josh P to come down and sample them. I never did get around to it, but the invitation is still open because there's so much going on in those just because of years and years of the beer changing. And that's the fun part. You end up with these little 1 or 2 kegs of something that's unique and you'll never have again, versus putting out a product that you need to sell, throughout the country.
Absolutely. And since you just mentioned barrels and a little bit about wood flavor, do you want to just give us like a 30-second elevator pitch on what kind of flavors you expect to get from barrels, in case there's anyone at home who doesn't really understand how wood aging impacts a flavor profile?
So of course it would depend on the barrel that you start with, whether you use a Chardonnay barrel or a Pinot Noir or a bourbon barrel, or just a straight oak barrel that's uncharred. Each one of them, our barrels in the basement, the temperature range is probably between 52 and 65 throughout the year. And as it gets warmer, the beer infuses more into the wood as it expands, and then as it gets colder, it draws it back in. And that process of just, in a sense, it's like taking a sponge and you're pulling the different tannins and some of the vanilla, if it's a charred oak barrel, if it had bourbon in it, a tequila barrel, that picks up a lot of different characters. And it's also the time that you spend in those barrels. If I get a freshly dumped barrel, let's say a tequila barrel, and put some beer in it, in 2 months, it might be so full of tequila flavor that you want to drink it then, or it might be too much and you want to let it sit and have some of those other flavors blend back and forth. So timing is a lot of it. I put beer in barrels that was great, that then wasn't so good. And then eventually, you know, it might have to go down the drain because it just gets to the point, it's like, that's undrinkable. I know you're trying to allude to that point that I made a beer that went a little bit vinegary. And
I wasn't trying to go there yet at all, David, but you can't.
I'm just saying that it sometimes happens to the point that, you know, if you make vinegar, you have malt vinegar. And then if it gets even too far past that, which I do have about 200 gallons of, and by the way, if anybody's local and they need, you know, 5 gallons of vinegar that you could kill ants with, not that you want to kill ants, but how about weeds? We'll kill some weeds with it. Or clean the paint off your car, but I have some of that. Thank you to fermentation.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that when you're making sour beers, when you're making beer in general, but especially when you're making sour beer, things can go very wrong and sometimes pretty quickly. And any commercial brewer will tell you that you have to be willing to dump beer down the drain occasionally. But the option that they don't discuss as often is taking your beer that you're about to dump down the drain and making it into malt vinegar, which is a great solution. And like David said, you know, so much vinegar now that he's giving it away for free if you need to kill the weeds in your yard. All you have to do is go buy a plate of nachos at Willy Brew and pick it up. I think that's great. I did see a question pop up in the Q&A about Gooses versus Gozas before we get too far from the Elysian Goza. And it does seem like John, who asked the question, recognizes that there's a significant difference here between Goza, Goose and Goza. Goose, for you guys at home that aren't familiar, Goose is a traditionally Belgian style. Jen did a great job answering in the chat. It's a blend of lambics, typically 1, 2, and 3-year-old lambics blended together to make a Goose. So you get sort of the best aspects of a young lambic and the best aspects of an old lambic blended together into this finished product. In Belgium, they're very particular about the fact that Goose has to be made even in a specific region of Belgium. They call it the Pajottenland, right in the Seine Valley. So you won't find many American brewers claiming that they make a Goose. You might find some saying they make a Goose inspired, or you'll see sometimes method traditional used as sort of a buzzword for the method behind what a Belgian brewer might do to achieve a Goose. Have any of the three of you on the call done something that you would be, you know, Chloe, yeah, I see you've got a traditional Belgian one there with you. Because for those of you guys that don't know, OEC is also associated with Be United Importers, so they have a great selection of international beers in their tap room. But Chloe or David or Josh, have any of you guys ever attempted to brew something that you would say is similar in vein to a Goose?
So we actually do a number of lambic style beers here, and actually I'll be speaking a little bit more to that when we get on Ouzo Ariza, because the beer blended into Ouzo Ariza is our Spontalis, which is our lambic style, and we are always very hardcore about making sure we're saying lambic style, because as you were saying, if it's being made in America, then that's not a lambic, because that is geographically specific.
All right, we can talk more about that when we get to the 5th beer then. Let's move on to the 4th beer. And I guess that means, you know, we're going to throw it back to Josh to talk about this Altered Contact Tart IPA and how this one is both maybe similar to your methods for the salt and seed, maybe different. You tell us.
It's so similar that it's actually that same sour base. So we, like I said, we're keeping 2 tanks right now. And it's the same sour base in both of those tanks. The major differences are brew house on, right? Is that the salt and seed is a much lower ABV. So we have to brew the sour base to that ABV spec essentially, or to that original gravity spec. And then we make up the difference in the subsequent brews through the brew house with Altered Contact. So we really crank those up, and then it's massive hopping levels for that. I think it's probably in the 2.5 to 3 pounds per barrel of hops. all, that's all day. So that's dry hops and then Kettle and Whirlpool as well. So that one was really, in our at the pub level, of course, we have several pubs in Seattle, and we have a few other outlets for those beers. So they're constantly just trying to do new things. And you've got sour beers on the brain. You've also got hops on the brain. Might as well mix them. So that's one of the beers that we produce. That's a heavily hopped sour beer.
Josh, do you just want to reiterate for the people at home? I know you sort of covered this when you were talking about the salt and seed, but you did mention that the lactose strain that you use doesn't fare well with hops, and now we're talking about it in a very hoppy beer. So how does that work if someone's new to this?
Yeah, so that's we have to keep the whole what we call the wort way. That's from the kettle on to the fermenter where we're keeping that lactoculture going. That whole way has to be cleared all the time of any hop like leftovers. If we did an IPA prior or really any beer, we have to CIP or clean in place all that hardware, all that software, because any hop residual could potentially kill our lactoculture. So when I say that we're putting this all in the lacto tank, all of that is pre-hopping, and then once we are ready to bring it back to the kettle, it's soured enough. We'll bring it back to the kettle, and that's when we start our hopping. Because absolutely, if we were to throw hops in it, it would tank the entire culture pretty quickly.
Hey Josh, you have a lot of body in that beer. It really holds up well with the hops, the sweetness. It's nicely done.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we do add a bit of lactose there as well, so that helps with the body. Those are still unfermentables, and then we try to keep the we use RDF, real degree of fermentation, a lot. That's where we're controlling a lot of that in the mash. With the lactose as well. But there was an interesting one. That's something that we've kind of looked at on panels. As a number of people, a number of beers were doing hoppy. A number of brewers were doing hoppy sours, and one of the things I really liked was that sweetness and body are not just to balance the sourness. I think that they add their own complexity too, right? Kind of like in a margarita, is that if you don't have some sort of sugar component, some sweetness, then it's a very different drink.
That's very nice. Thank you.
One of the things I think you did really well with this one, Josh, is personally, I feel like bitterness and sourness don't always play nicely together on your palate. So sometimes when I see sour IPA or tart IPA, as you guys have described it, I get a little bit concerned that the sour and the bitter are going to clash. But I think in this beer, the IPA is hop forward without being bitter enough that it really doesn't work with the sourness. So I would say, kudos to you guys on that one.
Cheers, thanks for that. I mean,
no, go on, Josh.
The big style these days, right? And everybody's pushing the hops in the later editions, right? So absolutely trying to keep that bitterness down and balance it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and to address that also, it's like when I decided to brew a sour, initially when I would make my sours, they were it was a party guile. It was a second runnings off of a higher alcohol beer that I was going to do, like a barley wine or a double IPA. And you end up with this residual extra sugar left in the mash that you could use to make a small beer, as they would say. And if I let the mash sit overnight, it might get a little sour. If I let it sit for a couple of days, it would smell like a dead person. But either way, it still made a good beer. But the issue is that you've taken a lot of the body and a lot of the malt character out of it because you've already rinsed a lot of the great sugar off the grain for your primary beer. So now when we do our sours, design a recipe that's going to have a little extra body built in, add a little carafoam, mash at a higher temperature, do some of the things that will at least give the beer a fullness, even once you get the pH down. And then if you're going to hop it, again, figure out the hopping schedule so that it doesn't make the beer, feel like it's just too thin and bitter and sour.
Yeah, those are all great points, David, as well. And I do see a good question in the chat coming up, but I'm going to save the answer for that one, talking specifically about Angel's Share and topping off barrels as you age sour beer in barrels. And I think that will sort of tie itself in nicely to our discussion about this fifth beer, since this beer sees some really extended aging and blending as well. So Chloe, with that, why don't we jump into this Ouzo Ariza, which is, for you guys at home, a really pretty bottle. And if you're in Connecticut, maybe worth a trip out to OEC just to see if you can snag one of these. I don't think this one sees any distribution, but Chloe could tell us if I'm wrong.
No, it definitely doesn't. As Max was saying, this is available in 350 milliliter bottles. Originally, when we released it, it was in 750 milliliter bottles, but this is a 10.5% ABV beer. It's also a real weird beer. So it's the kind of beer that we realized that we wanted to release it in a smaller volume so that an individual could enjoy it and didn't have to commit themselves to a 750 milliliter, especially if they didn't have, anybody to share it with. So I'm super excited to talk about this beer. This is one of my favorite beers that we produce, and it's real weird. It speaks to the real weird esoteric stuff that we do here that we have originally been known for as originally a sour only brewery. So I'll first address the lambic end of things before getting into this particular blend. So, like I was saying before when we were talking about lambics, so the beer that is blended into Ouzo is our Spontalis, which is our lambic style beer. So it's brewed with a 55% unmalted wheat. And interestingly, it's actually one of the highest hop beers that we produce, but you wouldn't really be able to perceive that by tasting it because we actually use low alpha acid hops, and they're usually aged between 3 and 5 years. So then this beer, as we were talking about with the cool ship earlier, Spontalis sits in the cool ship between 24 and 36 hours overnight. And then it is, again, as I was talking earlier with the cool ship, it's actually one of those exceptions that it does not go through the Beaudelet chiller. It goes straight, and it also doesn't get yeast pitched either. So it goes straight into oak barrels. Then it's aged between 1 and 3 years. And then it gets blended together between a number of those barrels. So, like we were talking before about barrel aging, we do a significant amount of barrel aging here at OEC. And so we have 2 separate sites on site with barrel aging. We have a barn, and then we also have a barrel cellar. And here at OEC, there is actually a specific position called barrel wrangler. And basically our barrel wrangler, Clark, it is his job to know what every single barrel tastes like at any given time. And then he is the main person, saying, okay, this barrel is ready and that barrel is ready and they taste great together and these need to be blended together. And so that's kind of one of the really key positions here at OEC is barrel wrangler. So then with Ouzo Ariza in particular, so our Ariza line is a line that we do where we blend beer and sake together. And so an important part of this is that in Japan, on the production end of things, not on the service end of things, but on the production end of things, it's actually illegal to do anything with sake except have it be sake. It has to just be pure sake. You cannot blend it with anything. You cannot add anything to it. So, as Max referred to earlier, our sister company is Be United International, which is a large importer of various European, Asian, African, Mexican, Australian beer, mead, cider, sake. And so we are the sole importer into America for Hitachi no beers. If you're familiar, they're the Japanese beer with a little red owl on it. And they are also Kiyuchi Brewing, which is a sake producer in Japan. And so we had started a long time ago doing various blends with Hitachi no beers. And then with Kiyuchi's blessing, we started doing again, where it's illegal in Japan for them to do weird things with sake. With their blessing, we started importing sake from them specifically with the intention of doing weird stuff with it. So we have a Rosea Washizuku. Is there a Washizuku sake that we just fruited with raspberries? But the Uzo Ariza, the Ariza line, is a line that we do where we blend sake with our sour beer. So Ariza is actually the Latin word for rice. It's actually, not only is it the Latin word for rice, but it's actually the genus name for all of the plants, horticulture nerd, for all of the plants in the rice genus. And so Uzo Ariza in particular is a beer that is a blend of our sour beer and their unfiltered sake. And then we take that beer and we age it in absinthe barrels. We have used both American and French absinthe barrels. And then it's also aged in Meyer lemons that come from our citrus greenhouses that I had referred to earlier. And yeah, it's just one of the weirdest, most out there beers that we do. It's really fantastic and I love it, and it's so wild.
I love this beer. I think I think you can totally pick up like the Meyer lemon notes. I think you get the anise or the licorice from the absinthe barrels. I think the wood is very present, and also the sake, and plus the acidity, obviously. It's incredibly complex. I really dig it. But what about the rest of you guys on the panel here? And any thoughts on this one? I know in some ways it's the most crazy beer we've tried tonight.
It's so weird, and I know that the absinthe is very polarizing. So this is definitely one of those beers that people are either super into or they're like, I want nothing to do with this. And I totally understand that, and we never take it as an insult.
For sure. So I think now is a good time to get to this question about, Graham's question from the chat from earlier. How important is it to offset the angel's share when you're barrel aging? And what do you use if you're going to top off barrels? Graham has heard that either Silver Bullet or the Beast are suitable. I know, from talking to brewers and from reading books, that the answer is it sort of depends on your brewing method. So what do you guys do when it comes to topping off barrels, Chloe?
I honestly do not know. I don't know that end of the process.
Okay, no problem. Jen, do you want to talk a little bit about like the science of why you might want to top off barrels, or what sorts of flavors you might be trying to prevent by topping off barrels? Looks like Jen's struggling to unmute there.
Hey. Okay, sorry, my computer froze for a second there. Yeah, so one of the big reasons is oxidation can come into play if you don't top off the barrels. Yeah, the angel share, where some of the alcohol evaporates out, right? Or some of the water and alcohol evaporates out. But yeah, oxidation can happen, and this can lead to things like acetobacter, which I think David will talk a little bit about as well when he goes into like when sours go wrong. But yeah, in general, oxidation can be tough on a lot of the different ingredients that go into beer. A lot of the different compounds, when they're oxidized, can lead to some strange flavors and stuff. So topping it off can prevent some of that from happening.
Perfect. Yeah, and Graham, I guess to your broader question, I've never heard of a brewer using, Coors or Milwaukee's Best to top off their barrels. David, maybe you have. I see you raising your hand. Go.
I know of a brewer that has. It's not me. But no, I mean the thought was just put whatever in there that's beer just to keep it at the top, keep the fruit flies out, that kind of thing. I know when I was doing the Rodenzak, I have barrels that just have beer that's not very hoppy, pretty much 7% alcohol or less, something that's between a golden and a deep amber, and that would go into a certain barrel because that would be what I would draw from to make the Rodenzak, the blend. And then I have the strong dark ales in barrels, And I wouldn't add an IPA to that either. And I wouldn't add anything red because, again, you're going to take away from, you're going to add more caramel notes and get rid of the chocolate and the roast. And then I have the IPA barrels or the barley wine barrels. And again, so, I mean, I probably have, I think, 16 or 18 barrels in the basement, different types of barrels. And I only add certain things to them. I have one barrel that all I do is put gruits into, completely unhopped beers. And I pull beer out, I add gruit back in, and it just keeps re-fermenting. And I think that's part of the process of when you're trying to come up with a flavor profile and you want to be consistent within it. You need to know as a brewer what your palate is already expecting. So when you draw the beer off, you should know, in a sense, where it is in that process. And then most of these beers don't go directly into a keg and on tap. They get blended. So sort of like a Goose would be, where you take something fresh and you blend it with something that's older. And then I let that usually sit, meld, re-ferment a little bit, taste it. Sometimes it's like, wow, this needs to be put on tap right now. And other times it's like, okay, I need to blend this with something else because the beer is mutated to the point that I still don't like the way it tastes, but I know that there's things in here that would accentuate another beer that I already have. And that's the beauty. I mean, you know, with Chloe, she's got her barrel guy there. Yeah, that's a terrific job. Please don't get COVID, you know. It's just there's subtleties to it. And of course, it's all based on your own opinion. So what my opinion might be, I think this is delicious. Somebody else might say, wow, that's so over the top. I don't know how you could drink it.
Well, that's a really interesting point, Dave, is that if Clark were to be replaced with a different individual, would OEC beers fundamentally change? And so in the very beginning, so, you know, like I was saying, OEC will be celebrating our 7th anniversary in June. And in the very beginning, the barrel blending was done by Ben and Tony, the founding brewers. And Clark was hired on pretty early. I would say within the first year and a half, Clark came on. So, and you know, like I was speaking to earlier, OEC has a flavor profile. Even though all of our beers are crazy and all over the place, OEC beers taste like OEC beers. But I wonder, that's an interesting point, Dave, is I wonder if that would fundamentally change if it was no longer Clark and it was somebody else.
Sal just said in the chat that you're making a great argument for Clark to get a raise. So Sal might be onto something there. You've just called him to a pretty large audience, integral to the OEC process. But Graham, also, you know, I do want to say to your question, I think the answer to your question depends a lot on the scale you're talking about too, right? And so I work for Artisanal Brewing Ventures, as Josh said in the intro. I do education and training. I'm probably most closely related on an operational level to the 6 Point Brewery down in Brooklyn, New York. And I could tell you from experience with them that if we're going to make a barrel-aged beer that's a 3-barrel batch, for example, obviously we can't afford to top off the barrels from one of those 3 barrels. So we would probably top off with, if it's a stout, you know, anytime we make another new stout that's not going to go into barrels, just take a little bit of it and top off those 3 barrels. If we were making a beer, by counterpoint, you know, a beer that was 100 barrels and was going to see national release, then maybe every quarter we would go through and sacrifice one of those 100 barrels and use that barrel to top off the other 99 barrels. And then next quarter, we sacrifice another barrel and use that barrel to top off the other 98 barrels, and so on and so forth. So just like everything we've been talking about tonight, it's important to think about, you know, a million different ways to get there.
And if I could, I was going to say the same thing. There's like, yeah, on scale, and then you think about people like New Belgium who have like massive foeder halls, and they're doing a very similar process in which they brew into a foeder and then feed a lot of their barrels from that. We were very similar to that.
Absolutely. And Chloe, there's also a question in the Q&A about, you know, the appropriate drinking temperature for this Ouzo Ariza beer specifically. And then maybe more broadly, you know, are there drinking temperatures that you guys at OEC would recommend for your sour beers across the spectrum? We haven't talked about drinking temperature at all. Why don't you start us off there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually, First of all, we have had a couple of times people, every once in a great while, we will have somebody contact us and say that a product of ours exploded. And it is always when people have not chilled the beer before trying to open it. For some reason, people get it in their heads that they want to drink the beer at room temperature. And we always recommend that all of our beers are chilled first, with the exception of like the barley wines that we release periodically, or the braggot that we release, spontanen mjod. So those can be drunk at room temperature, but all of our sour beers and obviously all of our non-sour beers should be chilled. Now, that being said, I'm going to take you on a little field trip again. So on our draft line, we actually have our coolers set at a couple of different temperatures. So for our, let's say, typically lower ABV beers, also for maybe less intense flavor profiles, those beers tend to get put at a lower temperature. So you can see here that we got, actually, because it's the end of the night, it's a little bit higher. Typically, the one cooler for the draft line will be around 42 degrees. And then our more intense beers. So right now, we've got Brewnice, which is our Flemish style Oud Bruin, and Ouzo Ariza. And then we also have Tempest, which we say is like our farmhouse saison, but it's intensely sour enough that it sort of has almost like a goose style to it as well. It's sort of riding the line between a saison and a goose. So those are all on a separate cooler, a separate draft line that is typically around 55 degrees. So yeah, with our more intense, robust beers, we definitely recommend a little bit of a higher temperature than, you know, our lagers, our pilsners, or our more lighter, refreshing sour beers like Aether, for instance.
That is definitely a pro tip for you folks at home. Even a lot of Belgian lambics and gooses would, recommend drinking warmer, 50 to 55 degrees to maximize those sensory notes. But please, please, please chill them down and open them cold, then let them warm up once they're open so that you don't have, goose or lambic spilled all over your kitchen. Take it from me. I've made the mistake before. So David, we've alluded to, and I think you've been thrown under the bus by a couple of panelists now on this malt vinegar. Do you want to tell us the story about this? And David, all of our panelists were kind enough to share beers with everyone else on the panel tonight so that we could all be drinking the same things and talking in similarities. Because as you've probably noticed, it's hard to talk about different beers when you're not drinking the same beers, especially with sour. There's so much range. But David was also kind enough to share a bottle of his malt vinegar with each of us for use at a later time. Maybe Chloe's going to taste it now. But David, how did this come to be?
So I make a lot of saisons, and saisons used to be a popular style where I could probably brew 4, 5, 6, 7 different varieties, starting with a nice light saison and finishing with a porter that would be a saison yeast, which would, a saison noir, let's say. And then every year I just keep brewing them because people love them. Well, as you probably know, saisons have kind of fallen out of favor, but I still love them. So one of the beers, though, and it's a tribute to Phil Markowski, who's now at Two Roads, but at the time he was at Southampton Brewery, and he made a beer called Cuvée de Fleurs, and it was a saison that had a bunch of different wildflowers in it, and it was phenomenal. So I did my own version of it. It had 5 different wildflowers in it, wildflower honey, and we used a saison yeast. Made the beer for many years. And then this one year, I brewed it. I put the yeast in it. And the yeast decided to go haywire, or whatever it wanted to do. And after a couple of days, I realized this was not a beer that was saleable in its current position. So I decided to put it into a storage tank in the basement and let it just do its thing. And months went by, and I would taste it, and it was lousy. Really wasn't drinkable as a beer by any means. And then I'd forget about it because you know how things are, like you leave something in the same place over and over again, you don't even see it. And that's what that beer did. And it just sat there for a couple of years. Finally, I tasted it, and it was delicious as a malt vinegar. Didn't know how it happened all on its own. And we decided to start serving it at the restaurant. So we do have Lily Brew malt vinegar. Basically, nature did what it was supposed to do. And the acetobacteria got in there, and we've been having fun with it. It's not your standard Heinz malt vinegar by any means. It's got a little funkiness to it, a little barnyard going on in there. But most people that we bring it to actually really enjoy it. There are those that, you know, it's not your standard malt vinegar, but it's funny. It was one of those things that, you know, life takes over for itself, and that's where we are. However, as I mentioned earlier, the one that you can kill weeds with, that was our holiday male ale that also didn't go so well, that we put into a tank. And that's about as strong a vinegar as you're going to get, not for human consumption.
And for those of you guys at home, please do not take this as, you know, David being the sacrificial lamb here, talking about 2 times that he's made vinegar, because any commercial brewer that tells you they've never dumped a batch of beer down the drain, I would question the quality of the beers that they're releasing to you as a customer. We've all done it. We just all haven't been innovative enough to make it into vinegar necessarily. So
I got lucky.
Hey,
at least once, you know.
So I've been drinking it, and Dave, this is delicious.
Wait, you're drinking it?
Oh yeah. Well, okay. So one of the weird things that Be United imports is Aigre Doux, which is a drinking vinegar from the DuPont family from Normandy, France. And so this is gnarly. And honestly, in comparison to the quote unquote drinking vinegar, which I do like this, but it is absolutely gnarly. And in comparison, this is lovely. Like,
Well, thank you.
I'm also one of those weirdos who like drinks hot sauce too sometimes. Like
I know, I do that too. I look at that Chinese mustard and I'm like, I just want to squeeze the packet.
Yes, but this, I mean, it's floral and it's got a lovely honey characteristic. This is really nice.
Thank you. Well, I have plenty more. Probably 180 some odd gallons.
I did see a question pop up, not in the Q&A, but in the chat. Sal was asking if it's alcoholic. I'm assuming maybe he's talking about that drinking vinegar, Chloe.
I honestly don't know. I never measured the alcohol. I know it did ferment initially, but it's been probably 5 or 6 years that it's been sitting in a tank. I don't think it's alcohol. Well, I can't say.
Sal, I will say, oh no, the malt vinegar. Sorry, Sal. Sorry, I misinterpreted your question. I will say as a general rule, Sal, that one of the reasons brewers don't like acetobacter in their as a contaminant or as an active bacteria is that acetobacter works by breaking down alcohol into the components that taste like vinegar to you. So the longer acetobacter is working in your beer, the less alcohol it's going to have left. But that doesn't necessarily give you the range on any specific vinegar.
The Aigre Doux, it is alcoholic, but it's nominal. It's like kombucha. It's like, I don't know, 2%. It doesn't actually say it on the bottle, but when we were in full service pre-COVID, we would occasionally have it on the guest menu, and we would have the ABV there, and I believe it was like 2.5 or something along those lines.
Awesome. Very cool, Chloe. I do see a question in the chat from John again, and this is a question that I was going to pose to you guys as we get towards the end of this. Do you have any, personal favorite sour beers? And if you don't want to name another brewery, styles of sour beers that you truly love? And on the flip side of the coin, are there any styles of sour beers that you really don't enjoy personally?
I'll chime in. When I went over to Belgium and went to Hansen's, which is a blender, they don't actually brew their own sour beers. It was almost brutal how sour their beers are, and they blend the fruits into them. They age them for very extended periods, but needless to say, by the end of that trip, I couldn't get enough of it. And I think like a lot, so many things, you know, initially people thought sour beers were something that there was something wrong with. And a lot of IPA drinkers, you know, wouldn't drink a beer that was too hoppy because they felt that there was something was wrong with it. It was just too bitter. But over time, you know, you acclimate to it, and then you realize there's subtleties in there that you wouldn't have gotten initially. It's like the punch in the face, but then you realize it was really more of a slap, and it wasn't so bad. And Hansen's is one of those that it's so over the top. You just have to sip it, but every sip just takes you somewhere. So for at least that's the one for me.
If I remember right, David, at one point I think I heard that the strawberry beer that Hansen's makes was the lowest pH beer commercially made in the world. I don't know if that's true, but I do remember hearing that in my early days as a beer geek.
And again, it's one of those things. It's too like if you have that with a little bit of cheese or some grapes, you have the yin and the yang of, you know, sweet and sour, and by itself it could be too much, but with something it's wonderful.
Yeah, Josh or Chloe, any personal favorites you want to talk about?
So Be United, OEC sister company, is actually the sole importer of Hansen's into the country. And so right now, throughout the pandemic, we have been able to expand on what we have available for retail to go within the tap room, because we had to, you know, cut back obviously on full service. And so we actually have the strawberry that you were talking about. And we have their Creek as well, which is, you know, lambic with cherries. We have the Oud Goose. This was the one that I was holding up before. But yeah, Dave is absolutely on the mark that this is just like the be all end all of like lambics. It's, yeah, very intense and gorgeous. And then for me too, like I absolutely love Hansen's, and also too, OEC has done some collabs with Hansen's in the past as well, some blends. It's escaping me off the top of my head right now what the name of those beers were, but we have definitely done blends with them before. And that's one of the lovely things about having a sister company that's an import company, is that we get to collab with all kinds of cool international breweries. But then for me personally, I really also love Flemish reds, Flemish style reds. Oh, I forget the name of it, but Suarez family did a beautiful Flemish style red a couple of years ago. And I also love Flemish style Oud Bruins. Apparently I like Flemish style beers.
Yeah, I'd throw another, you know, hat behind Hansen's. One of my favorite kind of goose blenders, just because they're so funky. I love all the other characteristics, that like high butyric, that like isopolaric. They got a lot of the funky, cool stuff going on there too, especially in the goose. I mean, almost anybody who's a traditional goose blender or maker is Frank Bone. Bone is entry for me for sure. And I mean, on the United States, Allagash, I think anything in their Resurgam program, Allagash Ghoulship, and yeah, as Josh had mentioned, some Russian River beers, some phenomenal. There are definitely some great producers in the United States as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Josh. You know, even in the last 10 years, the American beer scene has come so far when it comes to styles like these. American wild ales, our interpretations of Gozas and Berliners, and, you know, lambic style and Goza style, traditional European styles, just done really, really well in America. You mentioned Allagash, you know, top-notch program there. Last time I was in Belgium, I was blown away when I heard some of the professional brewers over there and the reverence that they talk about Frank Bone with. You know, because Bone Brewing is, you know, that's a lambic that you can find on shelves in America pretty darn easily. And we tend to hold breweries like Cantillon and Driefontein and Tilken on a little bit higher regard. But I was actually there on a study trip. I was with a couple of people studying for the Master Cicerone exam. So we got walked around Tilken by Pierre Tilken, and, you know, we spent some time with Jean at Cantillon, and both of them spent times talking about how smart Frank Bone is and how he's the master in Belgium, which I thought was pretty crazy. So maybe as Americans, we need to spend a little bit more money on Bone and a little bit less time worrying about the lambics that we can't find here. But yes, I mean, great options in the chat. I've seen Rare Barrel pop up and Russian River. There's a ton of great sour beer made in America.
There's no doubt that, there's been a resurgence of, brewing the styles that Europeans have been doing for years, which Americans have always copied because, why not? You want to make a nice English barley wine, you look to something like a J.W. Lee's or Thomas Hardy. And now we've done that with the Belgian sours. And so you do have Jester King and Cascade, and they're making great sour beers. And right in this state, too. We have so many people that are doing sours with fruit, just straight sours. We're very lucky where we are right now. I don't have to make them all. When I was only like the 8th brewer in the state.
We are definitely very lucky. It's a great time to be a craft beer fan in America, in Connecticut, but really all across the country. I travel a lot for work, and consistently I'm blown away by the local beer scenes in cities that you don't hear getting a lot of press as a beer city. Jester King, Crooked Stave, exactly. All great options, Josh. There is a question here that might take us a little bit off track as far as sour beers, but Kevin had a question in the Q&A. Has there been any success with adjusting the flavor profile of hops by using different temperatures, times, or any other separation methods, like steeping the hops quickly in water prior to their use in beer? I've never heard of anyone steeping hops in water before they put them in beer, sort of making a hop tea. Of course, brewers do manipulate the temperatures and times. That sort of gets into biotransformation and dry hopping or fermentation hopping. Any of you guys want to jump in and answer that with maybe some more information that I don't have? Any of you brewers?
Yeah, it's exactly what you said. Like adjusting, people are throwing them in the whirlpool and cooling down their whirlpools below isomerization to avoid that bitterness and kind of get a massive impact there. Like you said, biotransformation, dry hopping there. Yeah, there's definitely manipulating the beer for that.
I know I've done, hop teas before. I've done it also with, if I'm going to add coffee to a beer, you do a cold brew. As you mentioned earlier, Max, there's thousands of options to make the same beer. It's all how we do it. It's a question of when you add them, the temperature you add them, the amount that you add. Did you use whole cone? Did you use pellet? There's, that's the beauty of being a brewer, that you have so many options. And even when we collaborate and we take the same recipes and we do the same things, we end up with something different. You change your fermentation temperature by a couple of degrees, that's going to change the whole characteristic of the beer.
Absolutely. Yeah, great point, David. And then Josh, I don't know if you saw this question that popped up in the Q&A, specifically about developing a fruity lactobacillus sour. And then it looks like maybe Nathan has just a little bit of confusion about fructose versus fruity. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that was a good one. I was trying to type an answer so I could avoid taking up airtime here, but we actually add our fruit later in the process, so we avoid that whole the fruit sugar impacting that. We try to give a consistent word for that stream, but I think that is a good consideration for anyone who is maybe if you're kettle souring or doing that all together. It's certainly a concern, but for us, for consistency, we're just giving it the same wort, pull it into the kettle, put it back into a fermenter with fruit later.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that for Nathan. That's bringing us to a close pretty quickly here. Oh, sorry. I see a follow-up question there from Cherokee, who's also involved with Alvarium in the Connecticut beer scene. So Cherokee, thanks for joining us tonight. When fruiting kettle sours, do you all ferment out the puree? Or I guess the counterpoint to that question is, do you leave residual sugar in the beer, or do you pasteurize / chemically stabilize your beer? So that's sort of an open question, but I'll throw it to all you guys.
So I know when we made the overnight sensational sour, we put peach puree into the kettle near the end of the boil. And then near the end of fermentation, we added more peach puree and let the fact that there was already alcohol in the beer and a little bit of yeast that was still being active eat up some of those sugars. And then we let it rest for quite a while just to make sure that whatever was potentially going to be fermented out finished its process, and then we cooled it. So again, because we don't sell our beer outside of Willie Brew typically, and I don't have to worry about shelf stability, I wasn't concerned so much about something exploding, but it adds a little bit of depth and flavor by adding it late in the fermentation process, because it still leaves some residual characteristics of the beer, of the fruit. I'm sorry.
Josh or Chloe, do you guys ever package a beer with residual sugar, or do anything to either chemically stabilize or pasteurize beers that might have residual sugar?
So I know the original question was specifically about kettle sours. However, we don't do any kettle souring here, but we don't pasteurize any of our beers at all, including our non-sour beers. Not a single one of our beers is pasteurized. We have talked about getting a pasteurization going in the brewery, but as of now, none of our beers have ever been pasteurized. And then also too, for our fruited beers, a lot of times we're adding whole fruit, or we don't tend to do purees into the barrels, but with some of, especially our beers that have been bottled versus canned, you might find some excess in the bottom, some residuals. And, where every single beer that we bottle, we tell people, we've bottled it specifically so that you can, if you choose to, cellar the beer. I mean, we've had, on our 5-year anniversary, we had a regular from the beginning bring in a Tempest #1, of which there was no fruit in that beer, but only 12 bottles were released of that beer, and he had 4 of the 12 bottles, and he brought one in to share with us, which was really cool, and it was gorgeous. So we always tell people that our bottled beers will last longer than your patience to wait to open them. And with that being said, with a lot of our beers that have fruit in them, yeah, there's absolutely residual sugars that could do something really interesting in the bottle if left long enough.
Awesome. Well, what a way to close it. That brings us up to 8 o'clock, and I think I'm going to throw it back to Josh Prue to close us out here. So thank you, Chloe, and thank you to everyone else who's been sitting on the panel too. This has been a really interesting discussion for me as well.
I would have to echo that. Thank you so much, Max, for leading the charge here. To Josh out in Seattle, Chloe, David, Jen, thank you so much for joining us. We received a couple of comments throughout the way about whether or not we could have shared the beers in advance that we were drinking tonight. While we would have loved to have been able to do that, one of the challenges I'm sure many of you in the brewing industry are aware of, some of the regulations when it comes to shipping beers out is very challenging from state to state. So unfortunately, that was not possible. Plus, when it comes to beer releases, we don't necessarily know what's coming down the pike until like the week up. So it was very spontaneous that this group was able to put some things together through some connections that they were able to make that happen and get the beers in the right hands. So we apologize to those of you in advance for not making that possible tonight. But that's one of those challenges that alcohol regulations from state to state are just very different when it comes to shipments. So I'm sure Chloe's shaking her head. I'm sure she would love to be able to ship her stuff to anywhere across the country, but each state has some different regulations that prohibit that from being done. So we apologize in advance. But that being said, all the concepts and points that everybody talked about tonight are relatable in some way to some of the conversations, some of the pieces that you can find, some of the beers you can find at your local liquor stores, visiting some of your local breweries, whether that's here in Connecticut, in California, in Texas, wherever you might be tonight logging in. And you can take those pieces and apply those, the discussion points that they talked about today, and understand a little bit more about the process that goes into the styles that are sour beers. Not the sour beer designation, as we've learned tonight, is not a designation or a specific style. But that being said, we appreciate everybody's time tonight, and it was great joining all of you on this discussion tonight and spending some time with you all. You're all rock stars. You're all doing amazing things, whether that's in the classroom, teaching our kids about these things and the students of the future of UConn Nation about what brewing is all about, or making sure that we have great beer to drink, especially during this pandemic. We don't go thirsty. We definitely have some great things that we can push forward. And as we go into the summer months, I think we have some great opportunities with all the different beers that you all tried tonight to kind of make that work. So heard rumors about Rhinegeist here in Cincy as UConn ties. They are owned by a UConn alum. Yes, they are. So that is definitely a great brewery to go check out. We're working to see if we can get one of the owners on board here with another event that we're doing. But that actually leads me to the next thing. If you noticed in the chat, I did drop in the URL for our next 1881 series, What's on Tap, where we're going to be jumping into Houston-based Southern Yankee Beer Co., which is owned by a Yukon Husky, Sydney Porter. Many on this panel know Sydney. She started here with modest roots in Connecticut. She was an assistant brewer down at Outer Light Brewing down in Groton, Connecticut, and has done some great things out there in Texas. They're actually opening a brand new second location very shortly. So she's doing some great things down there. She'll be joining us. For those of you that might be in Texas, you can actually purchase a mixed 4-pack that you have to pick up on site. For those of us outside of Texas, well, unfortunately, we do not have that ability due to shipping regulations. So definitely check it out, spend some time. There will be a optional happy hour at the end where you have time to actually converse directly face-to-face in a Zoom environment with Sydney. She'll be sticking around for about an hour after that to have some conversation. So that being said, I know Josh probably has to jump. He just logged off for a second because it's 3 hours earlier there. So 5 o'clock his time. I'm sure there's something happening at the brewery he's got to do. See, he's making his way down to the brew house now. Max, Jen, David, Josh, Chloe, all of you, thank you so much for all of your time tonight, for joining us. We hope to see all of you next time at our next 1881 event. And if you have any questions or need anything else, give us a shout. We'll make that happen. And cheers, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.